In a chaos-laced morning at Sterling Industries, the executive floor froze. Vivian Sterling's 10-year-old son, Henry, was screaming, flinging glass, security helpless. Therapists failed. Assistants resigned. Headlines circling. From a far corner, a janitor stepped in tall, steady, navy uniform, mop still dripping. His name, Luca Carter. He didn't bark orders. He knelt, lifted a scuffed harmonica, and breathed a lullaby. Henry's fists unclenched. Silence rippled outward, and in that impossible quiet, the janitor finally became the only person who could reach him. For the boy, Seattle wore rain like a second skin that autumn. The city's skyline pierced the low clouds, and among those towers stood Sterling Industries, a fortress of glass and steel that reflected everything but revealed nothing. Inside, on the 40th floor, corner offices overlooked Elliott Bay, while polished marble floors caught the cold LED light that never quite felt warm. This was where decisions worth millions happened every hour, where assistants moved with choreographed efficiency, where even the air felt expensive. It was a world designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind anyone who entered that they were in the presence of power. 3 floors below, in the service corridors that snaked behind those gleaming walls, Luca Carter pushed his cleaning cart. At 36, he moved with the economy of someone who understood that being invisible was sometimes the safest way to see everything. His navy uniform was worn but clean, and his hands, calloused and strong, had spent years learning the geography of the building. He knew which conference rooms stayed empty, which executives left coffee cups on windowsills, which stairwells echoed when you walked them alone at 3 in the morning. He had worked the night shift for 2 years, arriving after most people left, disappearing before most people came. That was how he preferred it. Quiet, unremarkable, safe. But Luca Carter had not always pushed a mop. In another life, he had stood in lecture halls at Stanford, presenting research on pediatric trauma and co-regulation techniques. His dissertation, never finished, had explored how children process fear through breath and rhythm, how a steady presence could rewire a panicking nervous system without a single word. That research had consumed him once, the way a calling does. But then came the fire. The hospital where his wife Helen worked had burned one winter night, and though Luca had pulled 4 children from the blaze, he had not reached her in time. The guilt had been immediate and absolute. He had abandoned his PhD 3 weeks later, left the academic world, and eventually found himself here in the margins, in the service halls, where nobody asked questions about who you used to be. He had a daughter now, Audrey, 7 years old, all elbows and curiosity, with a gap-toothed smile and a habit of drawing people as animals. She thought her father cleaned buildings because he liked the quiet, and he had never corrected her. At night, after tucking her in, Luca still read journals on childhood trauma. He could not help it. The knowledge sat in him like a second heartbeat, persistent and aching. He just never used it anymore. Not publicly, not where anyone could see. Vivian Sterling, by contrast, lived entirely in the light. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in the company's history. A woman whose face appeared in business magazines with headlines like Ice Queen with a Midas Touch and Sterling's Steely Resolve. Her hair was platinum blonde, cut in soft waves that framed a face people described as beautiful, in the way a knife is beautiful, precise, sharp, effective. She favored red dresses with clean lines, and she moved through board meetings the way a conductor moves through a symphony, every gesture deliberate, every silence calculated. She had taken over the company after her husband died in a car accident 2 years prior, and if grief had touched her, she had locked it somewhere the cameras could not reach. Control was her currency. Certainty was her armor. But control had limits. And those limits had a name. Henry Sterling. Henry was 10 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that fell into eyes that had stopped meeting anyone's gaze 6 months ago. The trauma had started the night of his father's accident. Henry had been in the car, had heard the shattering glass, the blare of horns, the screaming silence that followed. He had survived with a broken arm and a broken ability to trust sound. Now, certain noises sent him spiraling, glass breaking, sirens wailing, even the sharp ring of his mother's phone during meetings. He would freeze, or he would explode. There was no in-between, no warning. Therapists came and went. Serafina Cole, a well-regarded child psychologist, had worked with Henry for 4 months before admitting that her cognitive behavioral techniques were not reaching him. Medications helped him sleep, but not heal. Vivian had tried everything her money and her desperation could buy, and still her son flinched when she entered a room. Still, he hid under desks when the board convened. Still, he carried his father's pocket watch, a silver antique that no longer ticked, clutched in his fist like it was the last solid thing in the world. Vivian's executive team learned to navigate around the boy's presence. Astrid Vaughn, the head of public relations, handled it with icy pragmatism. Keep the boy out of sight. Keep the media out of reach. Keep Sterling Industries looking strong. Beatrix Monroe, a board member with silver hair and an accountant's soul, framed it as a liability. The CEO's personal struggles could not become the company's burden. Flynn Davenport, the chief operating officer, and the closest thing Vivian had to a friend in the building, simply looked sad whenever Henry's name came up. He understood what it cost her. This fracture between the woman who could command a room and the mother who could not calm her child. Amanda Price, Vivian's executive assistant, was perhaps the only person who saw both sides without flinching. She brought Henry coloring books during long meetings, placed bottles of water within reach when he hid under furniture, and never once acted like his presence was an inconvenience. But even Amanda could not stop the meltdowns. Nobody could. Until the morning everything changed. It was a Thursday. The board had gathered in the main conference room for the quarterly review. Vivian stood at the head of the table, mid-presentation, her voice steady as she walked them through revenue projections. Henry sat in the corner, headphones on, drawing in a notebook Amanda had given him. Everything was fine. Everything was controlled. Then construction started on the site next door. Dante Wilkes, the contractor overseeing a new high-rise, had scheduled pile driving that morning, and nobody had thought to warn Sterling Industries. The first impact sent a shudder through the building. The second cracked the water glass on the conference table. The third shattered it. Henry's scream cut through the room like a siren. He bolted upright, flinging his notebook, his hands covering his ears as his breath came in ragged, choking gasps. Security moved toward him, but he recoiled, scrambling under the table, his small body folding into itself. Serafina Cole, present for consultation, knelt and tried to talk him down, using the measured tones of therapeutic intervention. Henry only screamed louder. Vivian's face went pale, her hands shaking as she crouched near her son but did not touch him. She had learned that touch during a meltdown only made it worse. The board sat frozen, unsure whether to leave or stay, trapped in the terrible intimacy of a child unraveling. And then, from the doorway, came a presence nobody had noticed arriving. Luca Carter. His cleaning cart was parked just outside, the mop still dripping faint streaks of water across the marble. He did not ask permission. He simply stepped inside, moving with the kind of calm that does not hurry or hesitate. His work boots made no sound. He did not look at the board, or at Vivian, or at the security guards who were radiating tension. He looked only at the space under the table where Henry had curled into a knot. Luca crouched low, 6 feet away, giving the boy distance. He did not call his name. He did not reach out. He simply positioned his cleaning supplies, the mop, the small trash bin, as if they were walls, creating a boundary that felt like safety rather than enclosure. Then, from his pocket, Luca withdrew a small, scratched harmonica. It was old, the metal dented, the wood worn smooth by years of handling. He lifted it to his lips and played a single note. Long, steady, soft. Henry's sobbing stuttered. His hands dropped an inch from his ears. Luca played another note, then another, building a lullaby that had no name but felt like breathing. 4 beats in, 4 beats held, 4 beats out. The rhythm was hypnotic, deliberate, a pulse that asked the boy's lungs to follow. Slowly, impossibly, Henry's chest began to sink with the melody, his fists unclenched, his eyes, red and wet, locked onto the harmonica. Luca kept playing, his gaze steady and gentle, as if this were the only thing in the world that mattered. And then Henry whispered something. His voice was so small that only Luca and Vivian, kneeling nearby, could hear it. "That song," Henry said. "My dad used to hum that song." Luca lowered the harmonica. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I was just listening to your breathing." The room stayed frozen. Security did not move. The board did not speak. Vivian stared at this man in a janitor's uniform who had just done what 6 months of experts could not. Astrid Vaughn, watching from the back, already mentally drafting the spin, because this, whatever this was, could not leak to the press without a strategy. Beatrix Monroe looked appalled. Flynn Davenport looked fascinated, but Luca Carter simply stood, pocketed his harmonica, and nodded once to Vivian. Then he returned to his cart and wheeled it away, leaving behind only the faint, wet tracks of his mop and the strange, fragile silence of a boy who had finally stopped screaming. That afternoon, Vivian called Luca to her office. It was the first time he had ever been above the service floors during daylight hours, and the elevator ride felt like crossing into another country. When he entered, Vivian stood by the window, arms crossed, her red dress a sharp line against the gray sky beyond. She did not thank him. She asked him how. Luca explained, in terms stripped of jargon, what co-regulation was. How a child in distress could not think his way out of panic, he could only breathe his way out, and he needed someone else's rhythm to follow. How the harmonica was not magic, just a tool. How creating physical boundaries without trapping a child gave them the illusion of control, which was sometimes all they needed to find real control. Vivian listened without interrupting. Then she asked the question that mattered. "Can you do it again?" Luca hesitated. "I'm not a licensed therapist," he said. "I'm a janitor." "I don't care what your title is," Vivian said. "I care if my son can breathe." Larissa Grant, the company's legal counsel, was brought in within the hour. She made it clear that there were risks employing someone without credentials to work with a child, even informally, open doors to liability. But Flynn Davenport, ever the pragmatist, pointed to results. Henry was calm. For the first time in months, he was calm. That had to count for something. Astrid warned that if the press caught wind of a janitor treating the CEO's son, the optics would be a disaster. Beatrix argued that the company was not a laboratory for untested interventions. But Vivian Sterling did not build her empire by bending to caution. She made a decision. Luca would stay on as part of the facilities team, but with an added, informal role: environmental support for Henry. He would not provide clinical therapy. He would simply be present, creating calm spaces, using techniques that required no license, breathing exercises, sensory adjustments, routine. Amanda was tasked with setting up a small room near the rooftop garden, a quiet corner with soft lighting and plants, where Henry could go when the world became too loud. Luca would help manage that space. Everything would be documented. Everything would stay private. Luca agreed, but only after calling his daughter's babysitter to explain he might need to bring Audrey to work occasionally. Vivian said that was fine. She had stopped caring about the rules that did not serve her son. The first week was careful, tentative. Luca met Henry each morning in the quiet room Amanda had prepared. He did not ask questions. He did not push. He simply taught the boy to breathe in patterns: 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. He mapped Henry's triggers: breaking glass, sirens, the sharp pitch of Vivian's phone during meetings, even the schedule of board sessions that took his mother away for hours. He wrote it all down in a battered notebook, building what he privately called a trigger map, so that he could anticipate and diffuse before the explosion happened. He gave Henry small tasks, choosing which broom to use, wiping down a section of floor. It sounded absurd, but it worked. Giving a child who felt powerless the ability to control something, even something small, could shift the whole day. Henry began to relax. The meltdowns, which had been daily, dropped to twice a week, then once, then none for 5 straight days. Audrey, when Luca brought her by one afternoon, did what children do best. She ignored all the heaviness and simply made a friend. She showed Henry her sketchbook, where she had drawn Luca as a bear and herself as a fox. "What animal are you?" she asked Henry. He thought about it, then said, "A knight." Audrey immediately drew him with armor and a harmonica for a sword, which made Henry smile for the first time anyone could remember. Slowly, through Audrey's unfiltered ease, Henry began to speak more. He told Luca about the fire dragon in his head, the sounds that made him feel like the world was burning. Luca did not correct the metaphor. He worked with it, teaching Henry to imagine the harmonica as a shield, the breathing as water that could cool the dragon down. Every evening, Luca documented the progress in his notebook. Number of episodes per week. Decreasing. Recovery. Time. After a trigger. Shortening. Vocabulary. For describing fear. Expanding. It was clinical data dressed in the humble language of a janitor's checklist, but it was also hope, written in careful handwriting that no one but Luca would ever see. But progress in private does not stay private for long. A financial blog, hungry for content, picked up a rumor. The CEO of Sterling Industries had hired her janitor as a babysitter. The headline was cruel in its simplicity. Sterling's desperation. Cleaning crew now childcare. The story was thin on facts but rich in insinuation, and within hours, it was everywhere. Astrid Vaughn entered Vivian's office with a tablet full of screenshots and a voice full of urgency. "We need to cut him loose," she said. "Before this becomes the story," Beatrix Monroe agreed during an emergency board call. "We're a corporation, not a social experiment," she said. "This reflects poorly on leadership." Flynn Davenport, trying to find middle ground, suggested a temporary step back while they developed a formal communication strategy. Even Amanda, loyal as she was, looked uncertain. Vivian, sitting at her desk with her hands folded, felt the old instinct rise. Protect the image. Control the narrative. Do whatever it takes to look strong. She called Luca into her office and, in a voice that was colder than she meant it to be, told him that he needed to reduce his visibility for the next 2 weeks while the company finalized a partnership deal. No more morning sessions. No more rooftop room. Just cleaning. Just his job. Luca nodded. He did not argue. He simply left. But Henry, who had been sleeping through the night for the first time in months, woke up screaming that evening. The nightmares came back. The hiding under furniture came back. Serafina Cole returned with her abstract cognitive exercises, and Henry shut down entirely, retreating into the silence that Luca had so carefully coaxed him out of. 3 days later, Vivian found herself standing outside the service entrance at midnight, watching through the glass as Luca wiped down floors in an empty hallway. He worked with the same steady rhythm he brought to everything, and she realized, suddenly and sharply, how much she had leaned on that steadiness without ever naming it. She opened the door. Luca looked up, surprised. "I made my son a performance metric," Vivian said quietly. "I tried to fix him like he was a broken quarter report." "I'm sorry." Luca set down his mop. "I don't want to replace anyone," he said. "I just wanted him to be able to breathe." They stood there in the fluorescent hum of the service hall, and for the first time, Vivian did not feel like a CEO speaking to an employee. She felt like a mother speaking to the only person who understood what her child needed. They agreed, without ceremony or contracts, that Henry came first. The press could say what it wanted. The board could object. But the boy who could not catch his breath mattered more than optics. By the end of the week, Luca was back in the rooftop room with Henry. Astrid was told to prepare a statement if necessary, but not to act preemptively. Beatrix was overruled, and slowly, carefully, the work continued. It was Flynn Davenport who found the thesis. He had been searching the company's archival storage for old project files when he came across a forgotten box of academic papers left by a contractor years prior. Inside, buried beneath lease agreements and safety reports, was a dissertation draft. The title page read, "Co-Regulation Strategies for Pediatric Trauma, a Framework for Non-Clinical Intervention." The author, L. Carter, Stanford University. Flynn brought it to Vivian without explanation. She read it in one sitting, the language dense but unmistakable. Luca Carter was not some janitor who stumbled into helping her son. Had been a researcher who understood trauma at a level most licensed therapists never reached. When she confronted him, Luca did not lie. He told her about Stanford, about the years he spent studying how children healed, about the hospital fire that killed his wife Helen while he pulled other people's children to safety. He told her he left academia because he could not stand being celebrated for saving lives when the one life that mattered most had slipped through his hands. Vivian did not pity him. She simply looked at him differently, not as the help, but as someone who had chosen to stay small not out of failure, but out of grief. And she saw, perhaps for the first time, that leadership was not always about standing in the spotlight. Sometimes it was about kneeling in the quiet with a harmonica and refusing to leave until the child could breathe. There was no declaration of attraction, no dramatic confession, just the slow recognition that happened when Vivian watched Luca sit beside Henry and Audrey in the rooftop room, all three of them laughing at one of Audrey's drawings. Amanda, ever observant, muttered as she passed, "You two should take your own advice and breathe." Vivian said nothing, but she also did not look away. The midpoint came on a Friday. Construction at the Dante Wilkes site had ramped up, and the noise was constant, a low, mechanical growl punctuated by the sharp wail of reversing trucks. Henry had been managing it, using the breathing techniques, retreating to his quiet room when it became too much. But that afternoon, a crane malfunctioned. The alarm was deafening, a sustained shriek that cut through the building like a blade. Henry, who had been in the executive hallway with Amanda, froze. Then he ran. Security tried to follow. But he was small and fast, and terrified. By the time Luca reached the scene, Henry had already slipped through a gap in the construction fence and was climbing the crane's access ladder. Rain had started, slicking the metal, and the boy's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold on. Below, Vivian arrived, her face white, her voice breaking as she shouted his name. Larissa Grant appeared with security, already calculating liability. Beatrix Monroe wanted to call the police. Astrid was on her phone, keeping press away from the perimeter. But Luca Carter, without a word, kicked off his work boots and started climbing. The ladder was slick and cold, the rain turning everything into a blur. Luca climbed slowly, calling out to Henry in a voice that did not demand or command, it simply narrated. "I hear you breathing," he said. "I'm following your rhythm." He pulled the harmonica from his pocket. Somehow, impossibly, and played a note between rungs. The melody was faint under the rain and the alarm, but it was there. 4 beats in, 4 beats held, 4 beats out. Henry, 30 feet up, looked down. His face was soaked, his eyes wild, his hand clutching the pocket watch so tightly his knuckles were bone white. "I can't hold it," he sobbed. "I can't hold the time. I can't keep Dad." Luca climbed closer, stopping just below him, close enough to catch, but far enough to let Henry choose. "You don't need to hold time," Luca said, rain streaming down his face. "You just need to hold on to your mom." For a long moment, Henry did not move. The rain fell. The alarm wailed. The world held its breath. Then, slowly, Henry let go of the watch. It tumbled through the air and landed in a puddle below with a soft splash. And he reached for Luca. They climbed down together, Luca guiding every step. And when they reached the ground, Vivian caught her son in her arms and held him so tightly that neither of them could breathe properly for several seconds. Audrey, who had arrived with Amanda, wrapped a towel around Henry's shoulders and whispered, "You're the bravest knight I know." Astrid Vaughn, watching from her car, lowered her phone. She had filmed the whole thing, but for once, she did not release it. Some moments, she realized, were not content. They were just life. The aftermath was quieter than the crisis. The financial blog that had mocked Vivian now ran a different headline: "When Leadership Looks Like Humility." The board did not apologize, but they stopped objecting. Beatrix Monroe sent a single email: "Proceed as you see fit." Flynn Davenport scheduled a company-wide meeting where Vivian stood before her employees and said, simply, "The man who saved my son is proof that the most important work often happens in places we do not see. I'm grateful he sees us." Henry's recovery was not instant. Healing never is. But he began to sleep through the night again. He drew pictures of the crane, reimagined as a giant instrument. He spoke full sentences to his mother without prompting, and he began to look forward to the rooftop room sessions, where Luca and Audrey met him with breathing exercises that felt more like games than therapy. Vivian, for her part, began to let go of control in small ways. She canceled meetings to attend Henry's art therapy sessions. She stopped pretending that strength meant never asking for help, and she began to notice the way Luca's presence steadied not just her son, but her. One evening, Luca cooked dinner at his small apartment spaghetti with marinara, nothing fancy, and invited Vivian and Henry to join him and Audrey. It was awkward at first, the CEO and the janitor navigating the strange territory of something that was not business and not quite romance, but was undeniably connection. Audrey told elaborate stories about her drawings. Henry laughed. Vivian, sitting at the worn kitchen table, realized she had not felt this light in years. There were still boundaries to navigate. Larissa Grant reminded them gently of potential conflicts of interest. An employee, however valued, romantically involved with the CEO, could create legal complications. Vivian addressed it head-on at the next board meeting. "We are not hiding," she said. "We are prioritizing what matters. If that creates discomfort, I will accept that discomfort, but I will not sacrifice my son's well-being or this man's dignity for optics." It was not a love story in the traditional sense. It was slower, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. They held hands during Henry's breakthrough moments, a quiet acknowledgement that they were building something together. And when Vivian finally kissed Luca, months later in the rooftop room after the children had fallen asleep on beanbags surrounded by drawings, it felt less like a beginning and more like a confirmation of what had already been true. The gala happened in early spring. Sterling Industries hosted Open Doors, a fundraiser for children's mental health initiatives, and the ballroom was filled with warm yellow light that softened the glass walls into something inviting rather than cold. Henry, dressed in a small suit that made him look older than 10, walked to the microphone without prompting. "Uncle Luca taught me how to breathe," he said, his voice steady, "and my mom taught me how to stand." The applause was long and genuine. Vivian, standing beside Luca at the edge of the room, felt tears she did not bother to hide. Astrid Vaughn, orchestrating the event, allowed herself a rare smile. Even Beatrix Monroe, seated near the front, nodded in approval. But the real moment came when Vivian took the stage and made an announcement. Luca Carter, she said, was being appointed Director of Community Outreach. His role would be to develop and implement breathing corners, small, quiet spaces in local schools where children could learn co-regulation techniques. He would train parents, teachers, and staff in the same methods that had saved her son. It was not charity. It was investment in the infrastructure of healing. Luca, standing in a borrowed suit that fit poorly but felt right, nodded his acceptance. He did not give a speech. He simply looked at Henry and Audrey, who were dancing under the string lights, and at Vivian, who was watching him with something that looked a lot like love. And he thought about Helen, about the children he had pulled from fire, about all the years he had spent hiding in service hallways because he believed he had failed. Maybe he had, but maybe failure was just the long road to learning what mattered. The gala ended late, the lights stayed warm, and in the quiet that followed, as staff cleaned tables and folded chairs, Vivian leaned her head against Luca's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." He did not ask what for. He simply took her hand. Henry and Audrey fell asleep in the car on the way home, curled together like siblings, their breathing synchronized in the way that only children who feel safe can manage. The rain had stopped. The city lights blurred past the windows. And somewhere in the pocket of Luca's jacket, the old harmonica rested, scratched and dented, and still capable of making music when it mattered most. The voice that tells this story does not belong to any one person. It belongs to the space between them, the janitor, and the CEO. The boy and the girl, the mother and the man who taught her that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is kneel down and breathe with someone until they remember they are not alone. It is a story about how healing is not a luxury or a weakness. It is a rhythm. It is something you learn by following someone else's steady pulse until you find your own again. Luca Carter did not just calm the heart of one boy. He mended 3 souls that had been fractured by grief and pressure and the weight of trying to hold time in their hands. And in doing so, he proved what people who live in the margins have always known, that the most essential work is often done by those the world does not see. That a harmonica can be a lifeline, that breath, shared between 2 people in a moment of terror, can become the foundation of trust. That sometimes, the person who saves you is not the one with credentials or power or certainty. Sometimes, it is just the one who stays, the one who kneels, the one who plays a single note and waits for you to find the courage to breathe along. And when you do, when you finally exhale and the world stops spinning and you realize you are still here, still whole, still capable of standing, that is when the real work begins. That is when you learn that survival is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning. The rest is what you build with the people who refuse to let you fall. The rest is family. The rest is love. The rest is life, lived not in the spotlight or the shadows, but in the quiet spaces where 2 people can hold hands and watch their children dance and know, without question, that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. The rain returned that night, soft and steady, washing the city clean. And in a small apartment where a janitor and a CEO sat together on a worn couch, listening to the sound of children breathing in the next room, there was peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of something stronger. Not the end of fear, but the beginning of knowing that fear does not have to win. That breath, rhythm, presence, these simple, profound things are enough. They were always enough. And somewhere in Seattle, in schools that would soon have their own breathing corners, in boardrooms that would learn to value steadiness over spectacle, in the lives of children who would grow up knowing that panic does not have to be permanent, Luca Carter's work would continue. Not because he sought recognition, but because he understood what so many people spend their whole lives trying to learn, that the quietest acts of care are often the ones that change everything. That love is not always loud. That heroism is not always visible. And that sometimes, the person who saves the day is just the one who stayed when everyone else looked away, who played a song when the world was screaming, who whispered in the dark that you are not alone, you have never been alone, and you never will be. The harmonica rests on the table. The rain continues to fall, and the story, like all true stories, does not really end. It simply becomes part of the rhythm of the world, one breath at a time.